Charlie Puth has always looked like the kind of musician who hears too much. Not just more than other people, but differently. The world does not seem to arrive to him as noise. It arrives as notes, intervals, textures, and possibilities. A car door closes, a washing machine hums, a glass taps a table, and somewhere inside his mind those sounds begin organizing themselves into music. That is what made his image so compelling in the first place. He was never sold only as a pop singer. He was sold as a brain wired for sound. A man whose talent seemed almost mechanical in its precision and almost magical in its instinct. Perfect pitch, effortless melody, polished hooks, and the ability to turn the smallest fragment of life into a chorus people could not forget. That became the fantasy around Charlie Puth. He was the guy who could hear everything. The guy who could turn feeling into structure and structure into hit records. And for a while, that image felt like pure advantage. In a world where most artists are admired for emotion, Charlie was admired for how frighteningly exact he could be. He did not just sing songs. He built them from the inside out, and people could hear the intelligence in every choice. That is why his image carried a different kind of fascination. He did not look messy enough to be chaotic, nor mysterious enough to be unknowable. He looked controlled, clever, hyper-aware. The kind of artist whose gift was so technical, it almost seemed to protect him from the ordinary vulnerabilities other musicians had to wear more openly. But that is also where the tension begins. Because the more Charlie Puth was admired for hearing everything, the more the public began expecting him to control everything too. The gift stopped looking like freedom and started looking like pressure. Once an artist becomes known for precision, people stop forgiving roughness. They stop allowing instinct to be messy. They start listening not just for feeling, but for evidence of intelligence, evidence of craft, evidence that the machine is still running perfectly. And that can become a trap, especially for someone whose talent is so tied to the architecture of sound itself. Charlie was not just making music anymore. He was carrying the burden of being the guy who notices too much, fixes too much, and perhaps at times polishes too much. That is the contradiction at the center of his story. The ear that made him exceptional may also have made it harder for him to stay emotionally loose inside his own art. Because when you hear everything, you also hear flaws before other people do. And once that happens, the line between genius and over-control can become frighteningly thin.
Before Charlie Puth became the kind of artist people described through technical language, perfect pitch, melody instinct, production brain, harmonic precision, he was just a child growing up in Rumson, New Jersey, long before the internet turned his gift into public identity. But even then, the difference was already there. Music did not seem to enter Charlie the way it entered other kids. It did not feel like a hobby he picked up later, or a talent he discovered by accident. It felt embedded in the way he processed the world. He studied piano from a young age, later attended jazz studies and formal music training, and developed the kind of ear that made ordinary sound behave unusually in his mind. That matters because no one becomes Charlie Puth overnight. The image the public would later love, the hitmaker who could hear music hiding inside everyday noise, was not invented by marketing. It began in childhood, when his ear already separated him from everyone around him. And that kind of separation has a quiet cost. A gift that strong does not just make a child special. It makes a child different. The more naturally something comes to you, the harder it can be to explain why it matters so much, or why the world feels slightly misaligned when other people do not hear what you hear. For Charlie, the musical intelligence was there early, but so was the first seed of the burden that would follow him later, the sense that sound had to be right. Not just good, not just emotional, but right. That difference found its first real public form through the internet. Before the Grammys, before See You Again, before the world saw him as a global pop writer and producer, Charlie Puth was a kid on YouTube, uploading covers, comedy songs, and musical bits into a space where talent could be found before the industry had fully decided what to do with it. That entry point matters because it shaped the emotional logic of his entire rise. The internet did not introduce Charlie to the public as a mysterious star. It introduced him as someone visibly talented, almost aggressively talented, in a way that made skill itself the first thing people noticed. He was not just another attractive young singer hoping to be discovered. He was the guy whose voice, arranging instinct, and musical intelligence were impossible to miss. That visibility helped him quickly, but it also locked in the first version of his image. Charlie Puth as the talented one, the clever one, the one who really understands music. And once that becomes your entry story, people begin meeting your gift before they meet your humanity. That is the seed planted in part 2. Long before the hit records and long before the pressure of perfection, Charlie had already entered the public eye through the thing that would later burden him most, the expectation that he would always hear more, know more, and build more precisely than everyone else. Charlie Puth's rise did not happen the way classic pop stardom usually does. He was not introduced to the world as a mystery to be slowly decoded, nor as a chaotic personality people had to keep watching. He arrived as a solution, a voice that was instantly clean, melodic, and radio-ready. A musician whose technical sharpness could be heard before his public identity had fully formed. That is why See You Again, 2015, mattered so much. It was not only a global hit, it was the moment Charlie's gift stopped being an internet curiosity and became a mainstream force. The song's emotional scale, tied to grief and memory, gave him the biggest kind of entrance possible, one where technical skill and mass feeling met at exactly the same time. Suddenly, the boy from YouTube was no longer just promising, he was everywhere. And once that happened, the rise moved fast. We Don't Talk Anymore, 2016, confirmed that Charlie was not trapped inside one giant soundtrack moment. He could build sleek, intimate pop that lived outside mourning and still stick to the culture. Then, Attention, 2017, sharpened his image even further. This was not just a singer with a nice voice anymore. This was a pop craftsman with instincts precise enough to make restraint feel catchy, desire feel polished, and bitterness feel smooth enough to loop all summer. That is what made his breakthrough different from so many others. Charlie Puth did not rise because people were still trying to figure him out. He rose because he already sounded figured out. The hooks were clean, the arrangements were smart. The sonic choices felt intentional down to the smallest detail. And in a pop industry that rewards immediacy, that kind of precision can look almost supernatural. The public did not just hear talent, they heard control. That image only deepened with Voicenotes, 2018, the project that turned Charlie from the guy with the hits into a more fully legible artist-producer. The album mattered because it carried something his earlier image had been reaching toward for years: authorship. By this point, he was no longer simply a singer people admired for perfect pitch, or a songwriter who happened to understand melody unusually well. He had become one of the clearest examples of a modern pop musician whose identity lived inside the production itself. The bass lines, the vocal layers, the rhythmic choices, the way he could make retro influence feel digitally clean, all of it reinforced the same fantasy. Charlie Puth was the man who could hear the entire architecture of a song before most people even knew what part they were responding to. And that is exactly where the hidden trap inside his rise began to form. The more the public admired him for being clever, exact, and hyper-aware of sound, the more his control started becoming his identity. He was no longer just making polished pop. He was becoming the symbol of polished pop. The audience began expecting him to be the guy who notices everything, fixes everything, and never lets anything slip out of place. That kind of rise is powerful because it gives an artist a myth larger than simple popularity. But it is dangerous too. Once people fall in love with your precision, they start demanding it from you forever. And from there, a gift can begin hardening into expectation. Charlie Puth had climbed from internet talent to global hitmaker to producer pop architect. But with every success, the same question was growing more quietly underneath the surface. If his greatness came from control, what would happen when control started costing him the freedom to sound human? The pressure in Charlie Puth's story was never the kind that arrives as scandal, it arrived as expectation, and expectation can be just as ruthless when an artist's entire identity has been built around precision. By the time Charlie had moved from viral musician to global hitmaker, the public was no longer just listening to his songs. They were listening for proof of his genius. They expected the ear, the perfect pitch, the polished arrangement, the producer's intelligence, the feeling that every sound had been placed exactly where it belonged. That kind of admiration looks flattering from the outside, but it carries a hidden cruelty. Once the audience starts loving you for being exact, they stop allowing you to be loose. Once they start praising you for control, they stop forgiving disorder. Charlie Puth was no longer simply making pop music, he was carrying a myth, the man who could hear everything and fix everything. And myths built on technical brilliance can turn brutal very quickly, because the world stops asking whether the artist feels free. It only asks whether the machine is still working. That is where the first real fracture in Charlie's story begins. The same gift that made him fascinating also made him vulnerable to a very specific kind of public doubt. If the melodies were too smooth, people called them calculated. If the lyrics were too direct, people called them shallow. If the production was too clean, people said it lacked mess and therefore lacked soul. He had become trapped inside a contradiction only gifted musicians know too well. The better you get at controlling the sound, the more people start questioning whether there is enough human chaos left inside it. That tension only grew more obvious as Charlie's career progressed. His debut album, 9-track Mind, 2016, succeeded commercially but was widely criticized, while Voicenotes, 2018, was received as a major artistic improvement, reinforcing the idea that Charlie could evolve when he trusted his instincts more fully. Later, Charlie, 2022, pushed his internet-era personality and hyper-online songwriting process further into the foreground, which made him feel more visible but also more exposed. By then, the problem was no longer whether he was talented enough. The problem was whether the world had started hearing his intelligence as overcalculation. Charlie's whole public image had become entangled with the idea of cleverness, not just musical talent, but cleverness itself as identity. And cleverness is a dangerous thing to build a public self around, because it invites people to admire you while also waiting for the moment your self-awareness becomes too obvious. It creates a strange distance between the artist and the audience. Instead of asking, "Do I feel this?" people start asking, "How much of this was engineered?" That is why Charlie's burden feels so modern. He is not the tragic genius destroyed by excess. He is the hyper-skilled artist whose very competence can make sincerity harder for people to trust. Even recent reviews of Whatever's Clever in 2026 have praised the album's musical experimentation, layered production, and personal growth, while still noting that some of the lyrics can feel generic or emotionally less piercing than the sonic detail around them. That response matters because it shows the tension has not disappeared. The same thing that makes Charlie Puth extraordinary, the obsessive attention to sound, still risks making the emotional center of the work feel slightly overmanaged in the ears of some listeners. And that is the real emotional center of Charlie Puth's story. Not the fear that he lacks talent, but the fear that talent itself can become too loud inside the work. For some artists, technique is invisible. For Charlie, technique is part of the spectacle. The world knows he has perfect pitch. The world knows he hears songs inside ordinary noise. The world knows he can break down chords, melodies, textures, and hooks with frightening ease. But once the audience knows that much about how your brain works, they begin to hear the brain before they hear the heart. That is why his journey now feels less like a simple career arc and more like a long negotiation between control and feeling. Charlie has had to spend years proving that the man who can hear everything is still capable of letting something remain imperfect long enough to feel alive. And maybe that is why his more recent era matters so much. On Whatever's Clever, Charlie has said he was putting life first and letting melody follow, which suggests not the end of perfectionism, but at least an attempt to reverse the order that once defined him. That is the burden, and perhaps also the hope, at the center of his story. The gift never disappeared, the ear never softened, but the challenge now is whether Charlie Puth can keep all of that brilliance without letting it silence the messier, less controllable part of being human, because in the end, the tragedy was never that he heard too much. It was that hearing too much may have made it harder to stop adjusting the music long enough to simply let it feel. And yet, what makes Charlie Puth's story endure is that he did not lose the gift, even after the gift became heavy. He still hears too much. He still notices the hidden architecture inside sound. He still carries the same instinct that made the world stop and listen in the first place. But now the meaning of that gift feels different. Earlier in his career, Charlie often came across like a man trying to prove just how precisely he could build a song. The hooks were sharp, the production was immaculate, the ideas arrived with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how much his ear could do. But in the present day, the more interesting question is no longer whether Charlie Puth is talented enough. That question has already been answered. The more interesting question is whether he can let all that brilliance breathe, whether he can let life enter the work before perfection seals it shut. That is why this newer chapter matters so much. It is not the story of an artist abandoning control altogether. Charlie Puth will probably never be that kind of musician. His ear is too exact, his instincts too tuned, his brain too naturally drawn toward arrangement and repair. But what seems to be shifting now is the order of things. Instead of beginning with technical perfection and hoping emotion survives, he has started talking more openly about beginning with life itself and letting the melody follow. That is a small change on paper, but emotionally it changes everything. It means the engineer is no longer trying to erase the human. He is trying to make room for it. That is why the current era around Whatever's Clever feels like a meaningful payoff rather than just another album cycle. The project has been framed around marriage, fatherhood, and a more personal stage of life, which matters because those are experiences that push an artist toward feeling before polish, toward weight before cleverness. Reviews have still noted the familiar tension in Charlie's work, the extraordinary sonic detail, the layered production, the occasional sense that the emotional center can lag slightly behind the technical brilliance. But that tension itself is what makes this stage of his story so compelling. He has not solved the contradiction, he is living inside it more honestly, and maybe that is the best ending possible for someone like Charlie Puth, not a total escape from perfectionism, but a more human relationship with it. Not the death of the producer brain, but the moment it stops being the only thing in the room. In the end, Charlie Puth will not be remembered just as the guy with perfect pitch or the hitmaker who could turn anything into a hook. He will be remembered as the artist who made the modern pop dilemma feel personal. What happens when you are so gifted at hearing everything that you risk hearing the flaws louder than the feeling? That is the legacy he is still shaping now. Not the myth of a flawless musician, but the image of a man trying to keep his genius without letting it suffocate his humanity. And that is why his story lingers. Because the most beautiful thing about Charlie Puth was never that he could hear everything. It is that even now he still seems to be searching for the point where hearing so much can finally turn back into feeling.